first of all then, Mike, and I guess the most important question really, how are you and in these difficult times, how are you coping?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you for asking. I'm good. I do lots of different things across education and health, mainly within mental health services. So obviously my workload at the moment is quite excessive. It's difficult at the best of times, but at the moment it's particularly challenging. I'm okay, but I worry about obviously a lot of my colleagues, and some of the things that I'm seeing from them are a lot of fatigue, a lot of sort of compassion fatigue, really, and burnout emotionally from the level of need that they're experiencing. A lot of patients, I think, are really struggling with the length that things have gone on for now. People are, I think, becoming increasingly distressed in some areas. But what's interesting is that there's a lot of people actually who were quite isolated before this pandemic with mental health needs, who actually have reported that because they're quite used to being by themselves and they're quite used to coping, they actually haven't found it as difficult as they thought they might. So I always worry when we talk about things being absolutely terrible for everybody, because undoubtedly there's a cohort of people who actually are coping quite well. So yeah, I'm fine, but it's the other people that I worry about. And probably I think in turn, that makes probably me not so okay when I spend more time thinking about how everyone else isn't doing.
Yeah, and you mentioned your role with the mental health side of things. Can you just tell us a bit about your rugby and education background?
Well, somebody's been divulging information to you, haven't they? Yeah, so I actually used to work in professional rugby. So I currently coach Bristol University alongside sort of other things that I do. But I do a lot of work. I run what's called the Athlete Mental Health Project. So I support professional athletes, performance athletes, right across the sporting spectrum. So I have, for instance, some Olympic athlete, track athletes. I have some rugby players, footballers, so right the way across the board. So I specifically work with them to support the mental health needs and throughout the year, not just at competition time. And obviously that's been quite challenging because for a lot of them, obviously some of them were meant to be in Tokyo last year. So they spent 4 years building up to that Olympic cycle. And now, you know, there's noises that it might be going ahead this year, but they're not totally sure. And the one thing that athletes love is certainty in training cycles. And of course, they don't have that. So it's at the moment, it's trying to understand how they could be flexible. For some of them, they haven't been able to train because of lack of access to areas. We've negotiated for certain athletes. If you're, for instance, a rower or a kayaker, you know, river access might be a little bit more easier and maybe a little bit more local. Whereas obviously if you're tobogganist, that's quite specific, you know, and although, you know, Carlisle and lots of places in north of England at the moment are looking like they could be quite good tracks. I think the worry about athletes at the moment is that things are so far up in the air that they've got no certainty about where they go. So all they continue doing is training, which then, if they are training, makes me worry about them overtraining. So, you know, it's really difficult to get a grip on. But fundamentally, what they all say is they really feel like they can't really whinge because they've got a job. And, you know, they don't feel like, you know, the Olympics is the be all and end all of people, you know, over people's health. But similarly, you also have athletes who might have had their funding cut because they're not currently able to train. So it's really, really individual how people have been affected at the moment.
And going back to your role on mental health then, how important is speaking up about mental health and that sort of thing to you?
So it is really important, and I think we've done quite well over the last couple of years of raising awareness. The only thing I'm concerned about now, and I've banged on about it for ages, is where do people go once they're ready to have those conversations? Because I know, working in the NHS, we are massively underfunded and under-resourced. So I, for instance, this week, have picked up the phone to people who've been on a waiting list for 12 to 18 months to tell them, I've had a 10-minute conversation with them about how difficult things are, to tell them then that I'm putting them back on the waiting list for another 12 months. You know, and what we know that does to people is it sometimes increases their distress levels or makes them less likely to seek out help again. So I don't really feel like we can have conversations about awareness anymore without talking about provision. And the two have to go hand in hand. We can't tell everyone to be really aware and to talk and to then think, oh crikey, we haven't got enough provision now. We have to understand that the implication of telling people to be open is that there are lots of people that are finding it hard and they're going to need some help. So we need to think about that before we tell people to have the conversation. But I'd also just say that the other barrier, and I see this specifically with a lot of males in sport, is that people don't have the language. So when we tell them to have a conversation, actually to articulate that you're finding things hard or that you're overwhelmed is quite difficult in the first place. Even if I'm talking to you and you're my best friend, even just the words leaving my mouth, they make it more real. Sometimes I've never heard the language before, so I don't know what words to use. So there's real logistical things that we have to think about for awareness campaigns too. So one of the things I spend a lot of time with students doing is not just explaining how important it is, but to also say, here's some phrases, here's some words you can use. So if you do need to ever articulate these things, guess what? You don't have to be depressed to experience low mood. You don't have to have anxiety to be anxious. But people don't always understand those differences because no one's ever told them that. So it's logistical, I think, more than just awareness.
And yourself personally, I've seen on your website you wrote a few articles, I think 2018, the few I looked at, about your own struggles. How did you overcome these struggles and what sort of things were going through your head?
Do you know, I always get nervous when somebody says I've read something you wrote because I think, oh no, what have I said? Like automatically I'm on the defensive. So I think, to be honest, they've been essential in helping me relate to other people. And I hope that they've made me a better professional, really, because I've been both sides of the table, so I know how difficult it is for people. In terms of how I overcame mine, I think it was really linked to my work. I found a lot of meaning in what I was doing. And so I think that in turn, helping other people helped me help myself a little bit more. But I was also very aware, I lived with a lot of children in care growing up. My parents were foster carers. So I'd always kind of had perspective that, there were lots of different people with lots of different needs. But I think when we tell people that your perspective isn't important because there's lots of other people suffering or there's children that are, starving, of course, those are big difficulties. But we risk making people think that they don't matter as well. So we have to be really careful. But I remember distinctively going to a project in southern Germany to do with mental health needs and just seeing how communities really built people's ability to cope. And it wasn't just relying on one person in mental health services. They were able to signpost them down to a local project based on their interests. And then there, they met people, they became friends with other people, they sorted them out with housing and lots of other support. So it wasn't just one person, it seemed like a community of safety and opportunity. And when I came back, I was just really keen on that model. And so I decided then that was really sort of what I was going to do for myself, and that actually understanding that work wasn't the only thing that was going to improve my esteem. It was that element of community was really useful. But I always say I'm really lucky. I don't have to worry about, living in a tower block, a threat of eviction with no outside space, possibly with children. I'm very fortunate and privileged. But for those people in those positions, they don't have access to the same opportunity that I do. So I really worry about talking about my experience sometimes because I realize I'm very privileged. So yeah, it's useful. It's definitely useful because I can relate to the person sitting the other side of me. And sometimes I do say that to them. I do say, look, I've been here before. I do know what it's like. I know how hard it is. And, we'll help you the best we can. So I think it's more of a useful tool now than it is a source of stress, really.
Going back to the lockdown then, what are the sort of main mental health impacts that it's had on people?
So it's a really interesting question because a lot of people, a lot of people thought I was quite controversial at the start of lockdown because I told everybody that based on what we knew from other areas and where there's been natural disasters or there's been populations adversely affected, what we saw from that data was that people really struggled after things had happened. The reason being because people had more time to actually understand and contemplate what they'd actually gone through. So, when you're in it, yes, of course, it's difficult for a lot of people, but when you're in it, so most people are just so focused on surviving that it's only afterwards they understand what's really happened. So I think that's reflective of what we've seen, to be honest, that a lot of people are finding this lockdown particularly more difficult than the first one. And we were told, for instance, last September, when kids had been out of school for ages, everybody said, well, what we're going to see is a huge amount of children with a huge amount of mental health needs. And as much as people did find it hard, we didn't see it on the scale we thought we did. So I'm not saying that it won't have affected people, but I'm saying that I think the rhetoric in the media of we've got a massive mental health crisis looming, I think needs to just be nuanced. So I always say to people, when we talk about mental health crisis, not every one of those people will be ill. There'll be lots of people who will understandably be struggling, but it won't be because there's anything wrong with them. It'll be because they've been isolated for ages. And of course, that's a symptom of distress, not illness. But some of the things I'm seeing, so there's probably a big increase in anxiety. There is also, and I think we're not talking enough about, there's also a huge amount of people who would ordinarily be going into hospital or seeking support and saying, I'm finding things really difficult in terms of my mental health, or look at this physical need I've got, whether it be, elements of angina maybe, or whether it be a minimal stroke. Those people are not going to seek help because they understand how strained the NHS is. So we've almost got a concern for people who are not saying anything at the moment, who are keeping quiet and just getting on with things. So I think it's complicated, but there's definitely been an increase in fatigue with the lockdown and the lack of, and the isolation. And I should say my particular concern at the moment is for people who are, for parents who are having to homeschool their children, juggle a job, worry about how they're going to pay the bills, and also be in the house 24/7. We all know what it's like, to be in the house 24/7, but some of us don't have that added layer of complexity. But when you've got kids, and especially some of the parents that I work with who've got children with special needs, that's an added layer of complexity and intensity that's so hard to cope with. And I just worry that this pandemic has really highlighted all the inequalities that we knew existed in our society already. And those people who have been most adversely affected have been the people who don't have the ordinary opportunities that many of us do. So I hope that changes going forward. And I hope it makes the case for people to maybe put a bit more investment into community resources and targeting inequality, really.
Yourself personally, how have you coped over the last 12 months, especially with the strain put on the NHS and you working with them?
So to be honest, it kind of goes in different cycles. So I support a lot of ICU colleagues who are obviously seeing a lot of people die at the moment, to put it bluntly, and dying in tragic circumstances. And I think what I find is I sometimes find it very difficult to have to listen to those stories and support them because there's nothing that I can do to alleviate their pain. And of course, it's important that we know that just by listening or being kind and all those things, they can help. But it's the frustration of just watching it play out every day that, actually they're almost being sacrificed in order for everybody else to get on with their lives. And so at the moment, I spend a lot of my time thinking about what's going to happen to my colleagues when other elements of life get back to normal and they've just got to go about their everyday business back in work again. And it's like living in a different reality sometimes. So to be honest, I find that very hard because I'm thinking about not just getting back to normal, but I'm thinking about, well, we're going to have to think about actually what's going to happen after lockdown. We're going to have just as much demand with just as little resources. So it kind of feels like a pandemic after a pandemic, if that makes sense. So for me, I cope quite well most of the time. But when I start to think about the future, instead of feeling relief, I actually feel quite more anxious and quite more concerned. So yeah, but I, again, I'm very lucky that I don't have to worry about food insecurity or anything like that. But I have, somebody 3 doors up with 4 kids who's just lost their job. So, I think probably me talking about how difficult I find lockdown is probably not not going to be helpful for a lot of people, to be honest.
And you mentioned at the start you're involved in rugby coaching. How's that for your mental health, and what are the benefits of getting involved in rugby?
You know what, I have to say, I'm dreaming about scrums at the moment and set plays and all of those things, because I just feel like I haven't gone near a rugby ball for absolutely ages. And to be honest, I think that's probably one of the hardest things, because although I worked in professional sport, I do because of my job now, rugby feels like a bit of a break, to be honest. It does more than a job. Getting involved in sport and any community activity, really, I think it's going back to what we said earlier about building that list of contacts, that community. And just, I remember when I played rugby, you were never short of somebody to be around. Even if you weren't best mates with them, you always felt part of something, and there was that sense of belonging. And I think people find that in loads of different places, art, sports, media, all of those things. But rugby is quite special in that respect, that there's quite a large community that goes with it. So I think it's great for my mental health personally. It's not when we're losing and I'm stood on the sideline and there's 60 minutes left in the game and I'm wondering what I'm going to say. But I have to say, I'm quite biased. I absolutely love my students and spending time with them and my players, because it's quite amazing, really. What they come from, all different walks of life. They've got loads of different types of personalities, and yet they then come to play a game, which they all commonly love, and you've got to make it work. And it's quite interesting to see how people go about it. And I know that there are people that play purely not because they think they're, the next Dan Bigger, but because they think actually it's really good for my mental health, and they play because they don't want a career in rugby, but they just recognise the benefits of playing. And I think that, especially with people who could probably go on to do very good things in rugby, actually is quite amazing to watch, that they don't really want the career, but yet they just play it for fun. And sometimes when we talk about university environments and sport, I think we get carried away with, competitions and first team focus, when in actual fact, the majority of students play sport because they just love it.
Yeah, and obviously with your players you coach, is mental health a topic around the dressing room or in team meetings and stuff?
If you ask any one of my players, they will roll their eyes and tell you that I'm always banging on about it. And the reason being is obviously, it's no secret. Obviously at Bristol, we have a significant issue with mental health needs, and especially in relation to suicide. So I'm very fortunate that I have the expertise to support that. So we do a huge amount of work. They all have mandatory training that they have to go on every single year, which is run by myself, and we do lots of different programs. So they all get basic conversational tools in A, how to articulate some mental health need, B, how to listen to somebody, where to signpost people, what to do. There's things like how to fill out a safety plan for somebody who's experiencing suicidal thoughts. But similarly, we also have a lot of initiatives whereby, for instance, my next 2 days now are just booked up with students who I'm just going on a walk with, because that's the only way that we can do it at the moment. So I got 7 hours of walking tomorrow, which my leg's going to be like jelly. But ordinarily, it'd be a coffee, and people know that they could book in with me off the field, or they can catch up with an older student, because we readily make that available. And for freshers at the moment, who are obviously in halls, who have not had the access to second, third years that they ordinarily would do, that's vital for them, because as you know, at the moment, learning online, you've got, maybe a couple of your mates in halls, and you might see people virtually, but normally you would meet people at Freshers' Fair, you'd know people from your course because you'd be in the labs with them or in the lecture theatre. But now they haven't got the access to that. So that focus on supporting people's mental health, not just because they might have a mental health need, but because they need that connection, is even more important than ever. So yeah, it's a very hot topic, and if you ask any of my players, they will be able to reel off all of the list of things that I make them do. For instance, if one of my players is late for training, the very first question is not, where have you been and what do you think you're doing? It's normally, are you all right? Do you need 5 minutes to just grab your breath or to eat something before you come onto the field? Because we recognise that, actually their safety and well-being, if that's in the right place, they perform better as well. So I don't understand those coaches that will say, well, it's none of my business really, because it absolutely is your business. It's your players and your students off the field are as much your responsibility as they are on it. So it's trying to understand that there are mutual benefits there for coaches as well as students.
Do you think in some uni sports teams then, where they maybe aren't as lucky to have someone as as interested in their own mental health, do you think the sort of environment can be, I don't want to say toxic, but sort of negative towards their mental health?
Oh, Haydn, you're going to get me into trouble now, because I've got this condition where if I'm asked a question, I can't not answer it honestly. Yes, I do, to be honest, and I know that a lot of people have done a lot of work. But you're right. I mean, my students are very fortunate in the sense that I can cover many of those needs because of my job. But for many coaches, obviously, they don't have that. So I'm not naive in thinking that for most coaches, it's quite hard and it's quite difficult. But what I do think is that some of those environments, especially around freshers, when you talk about, university sports environments, the biggest thing that freshers mention when they're talking about sports is, especially in the first year, is concerned about initiations, culture, all of those things. And so I remember one of my first years at university coaching, I remember thinking to myself, I know that freshers are going to get stick. It is going to happen. You're in that system and you've got to prove yourself in certain ways, and it's going to happen. But what I just felt sometimes is there was really disproportionate, and that what I'm concerned about is that if there are freshers or any students who are just purely getting that thrown at them 24/7, but they haven't had any experience of that person being ever nice to them or paying a compliment, then I don't really think it's banter or what it's labelled to be, because something is only banter if you have something to compare an interaction to. So for instance, if you're giving me a bit of stick, I know that you're not always like that because I've experienced you saying, oh, well done, mate, that was a great pass there. So I have something to compare it to, so I can identify that it is banter. Whereas if you don't have that, people just think you're horrible. So you kind of have to, I think, have a big education in sports teams, and especially student sports, on how it works. And we have a rule, I'll be honest, with my lot, that everybody gets it equally. That, if you're not prepared to turn around and throw something verbally at a third or fourth year, then you don't have the right to do it to a fresher. So we have to really make sure that it's equal in that sense. But I do think there is a big concern about the toxic nature of performance sport at university with how much timetable people have. So I have medics. They're in hospital most days, 9 to 5. And then I'm telling them that nutrition and, the 7 a.m. practice in the morning is absolutely the most vital thing in the world for them to attend. I mean, it wouldn't even equate in your brain, would it? So I have to work my timetables around what the students are doing and think about what's most effective for them. So I think even down to structure, as well as culture and environment, I think we have to be really mindful that a student athlete is a completely different athlete to most others.
And you're coaching a university team now, but you've coached a number of different sides, Blues Academy, Wales under-20s, England students. How do you feel these players who may be on the edge of a pro contract feel with the pressures of mental health and some of the pressures put on them on getting these pro contracts?
Yeah, so this is one of my big concerns, and to be honest, is one of the reasons why I started the Athlete Mental Health Project, was because what I saw happen was throughout the academy structure and throughout performance programs, you get maybe a sports psychologist, and they do some really good work. But what they often don't do is that they don't ever do some mental health support. Often they're just focused on performance. So they'll talk to you about psychological approaches to your next game, but you could be sat there with 1,000,001 different concerns, which are going to hinder your performance, that aren't ever touched. So I remember walking into a professional environment with a team who will remain anonymous, and I sat down with a group of players and talked to them about psych support, and they said that they'd never really been asked how they were or what was going on for them off the field. Yeah, there was one of them there that was 24, had a huge amount of pressure to keep a house. He had 2 young children. He was struggling with being a young dad as well, and all that pressure, and various other concerns that he had around his own mental health. And he was just being told that he was about to be released from contract. So, it's the human element of the systems I sometimes get worried about. So I said for a long time, of course, we can't always base our decisions in professional sport off an athlete's mental health. Of course we can't. I'm not saying that. But I am saying that those people that are on the cusp of pro contracts, or those people that who are maybe on the cusp of being released from those contracts, there needs to be a graduated response. And especially around retiring athletes, that's a big problem. And now we have some really good lifestyle advisors which work with them to transition them into their new elements of their career and help them find those things earlier on. But I have to be honest, the one big concern I have is with agents. because I've always said for a long time, I've worked with some brilliant agents who have been superb at looking after their players, but I've also met some quite exploitive ones too. And I've always spoken to them and said, your work with them now at age 20, you need to start preparing them ready for post 35, which is the typical span of a professional. So you need to start doing that work now. So that means setting up sustainable business elements that is going to be sustainable income for them post their athletic career. So, for me, we need to just triangulate it beyond psych support and think about what role everybody has in supporting the well-being of that athlete.
Do you think maybe like governing bodies have a role to play in that then, and they could do more to help certainly those players that are chasing pro contracts and everyone across the board, really?
Yeah, I agree. And I definitely think that for instance, if we think that sending everybody to mental health services or sending everyone to therapy is going to work, we're going to need a huge amount of therapists and a huge amount of mental health services. It's never going to happen. So it's going back to that community model we mentioned earlier, everybody having a role to play. I know people who are much more likely to have a conversation with their best mate or their coach or one of their mates' parents than they are to somebody in services where I work. So we have to understand that actually cascading information down and resources is really important. Governing bodies, I think, have a specific role to play when it comes to coach training, particularly. And I also think they have a specific responsibility to work with their players at all levels to make sure that they have access to the best possible support. And I should say, not always psych support. It doesn't need to always be a psych. You ask the majority of athletes, they'll tell you the majority of the times that they offload is in the physio room. And so, my question is why we're not giving physios some more training? Because the majority of them that I know will go, I'd love to do some more training because I'm constantly getting asked these questions. So it's about making sure that everyone in organisations has access to that. And so governing bodies pull those strings, don't they, in terms of funding and organising those things too. So how they commission training, what the statutory structure looks like for them, I think is really important. Because unless you mandate it and say, this is what we do and this is what you must do, if it's optional, a lot of people just opt out because they don't see a benefit to doing it.
And just to go back to the uni students, obviously, do you feel now during this pandemic, there's a lot more pressure on them, especially the ones who will have to write dissertations, on just pressure on doing their work and obviously the mental health affecting them?
Yeah, so I had the scenario just 2 days ago where there's a student who's obviously writing his dissertation at the moment and needs to interview 7 people. And his dissertation is on the effects of 9/11 on Islamic people with the faith of Islam in America, specifically women. Now, that's quite a specific dissertation title, but also very hard to get interviews. And because, normally you'd put an interview request maybe to organizations and then say, could you signpost me to people, or do you have members of your organization I could talk to? But a lot of those organizations aren't running at the moment, or they're self-isolating. There's loads of different complications. So I'm specifically worried about the logistics of people even getting information for their dissertation, which then, as you know, you're in the last year of uni, you spend 3 years, 4 years, however long it is, building up to it. And then that's going to be something that is going to make up the majority of your grade in places. And now all of a sudden, because of a pandemic, you've got, really adverse circumstances to work out. So a lot of my students have found that hard. I think there's also been a real issue in connecting up with other students who are also doing their dissertations. Where you live, as you know, if you're living with people who are doing a different course, they might commonly do a dissertation, but there might be some people who don't have a dissertation as part of doing that. So that, who you live with at the moment is your best possible chance of getting through those things. And if you don't live with those people, it could be hard to figure out how to cope or compare your experience to others. So I think we need to do a lot more around linking people up. And it doesn't need to necessarily be a lecturer or a course leader or a program leader to say, I'll make myself available every hour of the day. Actually, it can be, well, I know so-and-so is doing something very similar, so why don't you link up together and see if you can share resources maybe? And it's not copying or reproducing anything, but it might just be sharing the same people to interview. So yeah, that's what I think.
And lastly then, Mike, do you have any advice for people that might be struggling, or advice for people for what they can do to help people that are struggling?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things I would do. First of all, there's some really good resources on the NHS website. One of the ones I'm particularly familiar with is a website called www.stayinsafe.net. And on that website, there's ability for people to go online and access a safety plan. There's helplines that people can call. So it's a really practical way of supporting somebody if you're experiencing those things yourself, or if you're supporting someone else. So that's the first place I would say. Secondly, in terms of practical advice, I just think one thing that's really important is building in some time where you're not necessarily doing something. So if you're working from the screen all day, one thing I've said to people, if I'm sat here from 9 till 7, at the moment it's winter, so by the time I get outside, it's dark. And I don't really want to go out necessarily in the dark. So, can you build flexibility into your day? Can you maybe go out at lunchtime instead and say, I'm going to work maybe an hour later than I ordinarily would work, but I'm going to have a really good lunch and go out in the daytime. But also things like, one of the things we talked about was that a lot of people physically are hunching over their computer screens, as they're getting a lot of back pain as well. So, actually, are they getting time to relieve that tension through foam rollering or, massaging or whatever they need to do? So there's physical aspects to this too. But the last thing I think is just also, I think, giving yourself some credit and giving yourself a bit of a break. You might put on a bit of weight. You might not be exercising as much as you should do. You might not be sleeping as well as you should do, or even necessarily always doing the right things. But we are in the middle of a pandemic here. And so I think giving yourself a bit of a break, I think, is probably absolutely the first thing on the list.